Hey folks, I'm down here, little in the corner, so as not to interfere with any of the text on the screen. This is an introduction to William Shakespeare's Measure for Measure. In this presentation, I'm just going to give you a little bit of a rundown about what's happening in the play, which you should have read in Schmoop's guide to kind of what happens in each of the acts. So if you haven't read that yet, I would definitely recommend it because this is just going to be a very, very watered down version of what happens. So you'll want to have that deeper understanding. Plus, Schmoop does it in a really funny way. This play's funny on its own, but then Schmoop just kind of takes it up a notch. So let's talk about William Shakespeare's Measure for Measure. So an overview of what's happening here. Sorry, I kicked the table. You might have seen me rocking a little bit. In Act 1, we're introduced to the Duke, Aeschylus, and Angelo. We see the major political players. We see kind of what happens. We know that the Duke goes out of town, in air quotes, and he leaves Angelo in charge. Do we think this is a good choice? At this point, why not, right? Because Angelo is seeming like he's modest, so this could be a good thing for Vienna. But then we meet some other players here. We meet Mistress Overdone, who runs a brothel in town. We hear about what's happening with Claudio and, what his punishment is. Essentially, what happens is he has sex with his fiancee, Juliet, and gets her pregnant, and now he's imprisoned for it, and he's going to be killed. So a little bit of a difficult punishment, a little intense, as opposed to, kind of what you'd expect. We also find out in this, it's not listed on the PowerPoint, but we find out that Claudio is actually the first one who is going to be affected by this new surge in fulfilling the law. We find out that the Duke has just been sort of lax for 14 years. He's trying to be the cool Duke. And then Angelo comes in and he's like, no, we're going to follow this law. We also see Claudio asking Lucio to go get Isabella from her convent. Isabella is Claudio's sister, who's also just about to be a nun. We meet her and we learn a little bit more about her. Then we see Act 2. That's where we see Vienna's legal system and how Angelo presides over it. Just sort of spoiler alert, the Viennese legal system is kind of messed up. So Angelo meets Isabella. She talks with him. We see Angelo's initial reaction. He really, really likes her. And then we see the Duke, who's dressed up now as Friar Lodovick. See, he went out of town, comes back dressed as a Duke. Kind of wrong ethically, yeah, a little bit. But he does some recon and he meets with Juliet in prison, right? He's trying to get a sense of what's happening in his kingdom with Angelo in charge. We also see Angelo's proposition to Isabella. She proposes that if she sleeps with him, then he will let Claudio live. Another ethical dilemma. Is it ethical? Heck no, it's not. But, we kind of see Angelo's hypocritical side come out in Act 2. And then in Act 3, the Duke, who's still dressed up as Friar Lodovick, meets with Claudio in prison. He talks to him, finds out about what's going on from Claudio's perspective. Then Claudio and Isabella talk about what's happening. The Duke meets Isabella, and he suggests a solution for her plight. Remember, she still thinks that he's Friar Lodovick, so she thinks that she's talking to someone who she can speak freely with, someone who is a confessor. Not a confessor, but someone who can take confession. So we see her kind of speaking freely with Friar Lodovick, which she would not do if she realized he were the Duke. The Duke does a little bit more recon. Lucio puts his foot in his mouth, and then the Duke shows his disappointment for Angelo in a soliloquy to the audience. So none of the other characters see that disappointment. It's just the Duke and the audience. Okay, then in Act 4, we meet Mariana and the Duke, who's still dressed up as Friar Lodovick. And Isabella, or the Duke and Isabella, propose their plan, which is essentially that Mariana, who is Angelo's spurned fiance, sleep with Angelo instead of Isabella, right? They just sort of do a bed trick, as they call it, and just sort of swap out women. So we then meet the jailers, and we see the ineffectiveness of the Viennese legal system. Lucio again puts his foot in his mouth. Angelo gets word of the Duke's return, right? And behind the scenes, we know that Mariana meets with Angelo and sleeps with him. But then Angelo sends word that Claudio is to be killed anyway. Okay. Then in Act 5, the Duke returns, but then he kind of, says, Angelo, you hear the allegations that are being brought against you. and he excuses himself to dress up as Friar Ludovic again. Now, keep in mind that Act 5 takes place in public, so anyone in the town can see, and we see that there are onlookers here, or we know that there are onlookers here. The Duke proposes solutions and punishments for everyone. Those solutions and punishments typically are in the form of marriage, but we see the Duke, meting out marriage and saying, okay, Lucio, you need to marry Kate Keepdown because you got her pregnant. Angelo, you have to marry Mariana because you slept with her, and plus, like, you should have married her already. And then he proposes to Isabella and says, and you should marry me. And Isabella does not respond. He asks her twice. Twice she says nothing. Right, so what does that leave us as far as a resolution between the Duke and Isabella? Not too much. But you'll see that Eugenie Freed actually kind of talks about this a little bit in those articles that in one of the articles I asked you to take a look at. So now that you have just sort of a brief overview of what happens in the play, let's take a look at what happens inside these articles. So we have two. The first one is Gods by Office, the Ruler and Measure for Measure. You can kind of tell by the title that this is going to be a discussion about politics and the political field that's happening in Shakespeare's play. So the overall idea of the piece, which it basically does four things. It establishes how Measure for Measure is situated in the historical scheme of the world, right? It also shows the connection between King James I and Angelo. Angelo is also a satirical and ironic version of King James, also hypocritical. And it shows how entrenched the world of Measure for Measure is in Jacobean politics. It also shows how the puritanical characters develop a sense of humanity and recognition of human frailty in the play. So let's look at the historical situation. The relationship between King James and Shakespeare's theater company takes up the first couple of pages. Essentially, King James loves the theater. He loved the theater when he was King of Scotland. He actually had English players come over and act out English plays for him over there, which caused some controversy. But then he comes into England, takes control of that country as well, and he renames Shakespeare's company from the Lord Chamberlain's men to the King's men, right? So he elevates their status. So we can see that now the King's men have this higher patronage than the Lord Chamberlain's men. It kind of elevates them and makes them fancier. It shows that they are kind of the best of the best. It also establishes King James' ideology for ruling. Now, Eugenie Freed uses James's the Basilican Doron and the true laws of free monarchies. I didn't spell that wrong. It's spelled weird because everyone spelled things wrong. Wrong to standard English now in the 1600s. They just kind of threw in extra vowels, extra letters, stuff like that. So if you trip over any extra letters in the text, just know that they're not typos. It's just that, they spelled things weird. There was just no standardized English. So if you run into that issue as you're reading, just sort of sound it out, say it out loud, and you should be able to get it. But it established James's ideology for ruling, which was essentially, I'm in charge. God put me in charge. I'm awesome. You need to listen to me. That's essentially what James's ideology for ruling was. Okay, so you want to kind of keep that in mind as you go. It also discusses other writings that help to establish King James as the absolute monarch. Now, how does this impact the play Measure for Measure? Well, we can see that now that Shakespeare's company is called the King's Men, they're going to put these plays on for the king. They always did. They always had like a royal patronage, but now it's even more obvious that they're going to be doing that. So, we have a play that's written in a way to criticize what's happening with King James, in a way to sort of unpack the political climate of Jacobean politics. Okay, so we see on page 19 that King James admits in his advice to his son that he's been guilty of letting slip the laws. Right, so this is very similar to the Duke, who hasn't enforced the laws in Vienna in 14 years. You can kind of see that connection there. So Freed kind of develops that a little bit more and shows, okay, so this is a similarity between the political field that's happening in the real world, right, IRL, in Jacobean times. Yeah, I just said IRL. Go with it. So he sees that happening in reality. And then we see Shakespeare's version in Measure for Measure, and we can kind of draw those parallels. Now, would King James draw those parallels? For Shakespeare, let's hope not. Because he may. But we kind of want to keep that in mind, that that's happening, and it's a representation of King James. Also, we know that based on Freud's analysis, having heard Angelo soliloquize his inmost thoughts, the audience is party to the double entendre of his denunciation of fornication, which King James had similarly, but without irony, condemned. So Angelo, when he asks Isabella to sleep with him in order to save her brother's life, is being a hypocrite, essentially. King James has denounced fornication, sex before marriage, but he has not acted in the same way as Angelo, at least in public record. Who knows? But that's Freud's analysis there. Also, we know that one of the chief purposes served by the comedy of the subplot, interwoven between serious scenes and the main plot, is to reveal humanity's tendency toward anarchy, especially in relation to sexual mores. Now, this subplot that Freud is talking about on page 19 is actually the subplot that refers to Mistress Overdone and her brothel. It refers to Lucio's interactions with the prostitutes there, Pompey's interactions with the prostitutes there, because he works in the brothel as well, right? So we see all of these things, and it's saying, like, humans have a tendency towards anarchy, to do what they want, regardless of repercussions, right? Especially in relation to these sexual mores. So it's the job of the overarching policy, or of the overarching political party, in this case, King James, or the Duke / Angelo, who is the acting Duke, to stop these laws from slipping. Okay, and then we see, and in the culmination of Freud's analysis, Shakespeare's final synthesis suggests that a good ruler will learn to understand human frailty and treat it with compassion. Measureless mutual forgiveness, implicit in the precept from which Shakespeare drew the title of the play, dominates its resolution. Right? So this idea that people are only human is the biggest thing that he wants the reader to take away from this play. Right? This idea that humans make mistakes, that we are fallible, and that a good ruler needs to recognize that humans make mistakes and are fallible. So we also see the puritanical characters in the play recognizing this human frailty. We see Isabella and we see Angelo. For Isabella, we see Isabella's metaphors regarding her sacrifice to save her brother suggests a collusion of masochism, perverted sexuality, and a sick craving for martyrdom. Isabella would gladly sacrifice the life of her brother for her virginity, even deluding herself that he would be willing to surrender it. So here, what Freud is saying is that, Isabella is acting a martyr here, right? But she's doing it backwards, right? She says that she would sacrifice her life to save her brother, but she won't sacrifice her virginity because that's a representation of her immortal soul, right? She won't sacrifice her soul because it's immortal, but she would sacrifice her mortal, finite life to save her brother, right? So it's this weird, martyrdom, as Freud says, that she's kind of working with here. We also see that Isabella affirms her warped zeal in the scene with her imprisoned brother when he admits that, in fact, he would rather live than offer up his life for his sister's virginity. So we see that, Isabella is, not willing to sacrifice her virginity to save her brother, and we see that her brother is not willing to sacrifice his life to save his sister's virginity, right? Even though she's a nun, right? He obviously knows that this is something that's important to her. She wants to be part of the strictest sect of her religion, but you know what? Whatever. So we kind of see how these characters can be hypocritical and what they're kind of doing, kind of playing off of each other, how they're doing that in the play. And we also see at the end, Isabella joins Mariana to beg for Angelo's life. And we see that this is kind of her representation of human frailty. She goes from being this sort of stark, puritanical character, right? This person who values purity, who values, these really strict rules, to being a different young woman, more humane than the one who would have condemned her brother to death, right? Because she's pleading for Angelo's life, even though Angelo commits the same act that Claudio has committed. Okay, so we kind of see that human frailty, her recognition of it in that particular moment. And then for Angelo, we see that the play's underplot reveals the constant conflict between the secret or the strict life of self-denial that both Angelo and Isabella have embraced and man's innate carnality, right? So we see how Angelo and Isabella are both, kind of pushing against this idea that they've been kind of working through this lifestyle that they've chosen, and kind of where they find themselves situated at the end of the play. So it's this conflict between this desire to be stark and strict, and then to be more open and honest, and recognizing other people's pitfalls and their own, right? Recognizing that they themselves have those same pitfalls. All right, so moving on to the next piece of evidence here, we need to talk about Vienna. Robb Worrall looks at the setting of Shakespeare's Measure for Measure. So this is a much more specific, this doesn't situate it in historical context or anything like that. This is more like those secondary sources that you're finding for your essays, right? So the general idea is that it shows how the setting of Vienna is similar to a family unit. It shows how women in Vienna are second-class citizens, only seen in terms of the needs and wants of men, and it shows the potential for renewal in the play and discusses whether that potential is realized, right? That potential for renewal. So how is it similar to a family unit? Well, the Worrall indicates in paragraph 1 that the Duke is the father of a child of a wealthy but split family, partly neglected, partly overindulged. They've been allowed to do whatever they want. And so because of that, they are now spoiled. They can make choices without recognizing the consequences. They don't have any laws to follow. He then poses a question: where is the city's mother? Okay, and then later on in paragraph 13, he actually goes to answer not necessarily where the city's mother is. He kind of indicates that that city's mother should be Isabella, based on what's happening within the play, since the Duke asks Isabella to marry him. But he says Vienna is a troubled child. It is so because it has not been properly nurtured, right? It's missed that nourishment of a mother, and so it is now wayward because of that. So how did he talk about how women in Vienna are second-class citizens? Well, he says, what happens to Mrs. Elbow's suit for slander? Literally, it's laughed out of court. Angelo becomes bored and leaves the hearing. This happens. Sure, Elbow uses malapropisms, so he uses words improperly throughout his deposition, I guess. But essentially, Angelo leaves, and what happens? Absolutely nothing. So it shows total disregard for the fact that Mrs. Elbow was slandered by someone else. And this shows an utter disrespect for women. We also see that Angelo has rejected Mariana because she lost her dowry, suggesting that Angelo only proposed to her because she was an heiress whose wealth could support his ambitions. So Mariana wasn't valued as a human being. Mariana was valued as a checkbook. Okay, so we can see that he does not elevate her to the position of human. He sees her as an object that can be used for his own benefit. And we also see, in terms of kind of more generally in the play, due to his erasure of the women of ill repute after Act 4, Scene 3, Shakespeare, in the role of proto-feminist, could be seen to be suggesting that a sulky and dissolute child depends upon a mother figure to nurture it. So right again about that idea of nurturing this city, nurturing this child that is, just sort of out of control. So all of these women who are going to lead Vienna down a wayward path end up becoming people who are just sort of shunted out of the play. And the only people who are left are those who could potentially nurture it. People like Mariana, people like Isabella, who understand, that human frailty that Fried was talking about, at least at this point in the play. So the potential for renewal. Worrall asks us a few questions. Okay, he says, does the text support the assumption that Isabella accepts Duke Vincentio's proposal? No. Does the text deny it? No. Does the characterization offer sufficient psychological inference that she is likely either to accept or reject the proposal? No. So all of these ideas of Vienna getting a new mother, right? We don't know. So the potential for renewal is there, but is that actual renewal there? There's no actual answer for that. I'm going to leave that up to you. So you take a look at this play, you read it, you understand it, and then you determine whether she goes to accept the Duke's proposal or not. And based on what you see, does this offer renewal for the city? Thanks, guys. Have a great rest of your day. Do great things, and I will see you in another video.